The Second Amendment is not just a right for Americans to keep and bear arms. The Second Amendment is a human right on a global sphere that allows people to keep and bear arms. Now, in today's video, we're going to be talking about rights. More importantly, where rights come from and really the purpose of government. Now, some of you are always looking for the bottom line up front. You're looking for the actionable piece of information that you can use or at least form an opinion about how things are moving forward in our gun rights community. That's perfectly acceptable. In fact, I think that's actually fantastic. That's one of the really, really cool things about the internet and about things like YouTube. We don't have to wait for some news broadcast to make a decision as to whether or not even reporting on this news has some value or merit. We can actually have very, very tailored subject matter discussions. So in general, I think that's absolutely fantastic. But oftentimes, we don't really understand the underlying philosophical foundations of what it is we're looking at. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video. The Second Amendment is, most of us recognize, a fundamental right. But most of us don't really know where rights come from. You know, a lot of times when I'm doing a CCW class or I'm doing a lecture to a group of students, I'll ask the question, I'll posit the idea. Okay, well, we know it's a right, but where do rights come from? And about 90% of my students will say, well, they come from government. They come from the Constitution. And that is fundamentally inaccurate. Rights do not come from government. Rights do not come from the Constitution. Government exists for a singular purpose, and that is the preservation of rights.
Quick pause here to remind you that we have a super secret giveaway going on right now. It's absolutely free. Just click the link in the description down below to find out what you could win. Now back to the video.
Rights have to come from somewhere else. And in fact, they come from somewhere that pre-exists the Constitution. The Constitution recognizes pre-existing rights. All right, so if we're going to start not at the Constitution, but before that, the next logical place is the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence is really our nation's founding animating document. And in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, they sort of tackled this philosophical issue head on. One of the most famous quotes in the Declaration is that all men, we can extrapolate that in modern times to also include women, of course, but all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I really want to deconstruct this sentence because everything that we talk about as it relates to the Second Amendment really is animated by that single sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is actually how I should have started out the quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning that there is no explanation required. These truths being self-evident means that even someone born with absolute tabula rasa, no knowledge at all, can still understand that these truths fundamentally exist. That all men are created equal. Okay, that makes logical sense, and are endowed by their Creator. This is an important one we need to stop on. The Creator. Now, we do come from a strong Judeo-Christian background, but Creator was an interesting word. They specifically didn't say and are endowed by God. That would have been, frankly, far more efficient. Instead, they said that all men are endowed by their Creator. Well, why did they choose that word? Well, because they sort of understood that not all cultures, not all peoples, and frankly, throughout time, an understanding of cosmology could theoretically change. Okay, but the Creator, the origin point, God, right? That was transmutable. That was something that was always going to exist, that there is, in fact, a higher power. Now, how you choose to reference this higher power, that's sort of up to you. You could call it God. You could call it Gaia, Mother Nature, the Pastafarian spaghetti monster. Look, I'm not a theologian. Okay, I'm somewhat of an amateur theologian, but that notwithstanding, the concept of the Creator is, in fact, in and of itself, all-encompassing. So all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. What does inalienable mean? It means we can't get rid of them. We're stuck with them. All right, even if we wanted to relinquish these rights, we couldn't. All right, amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you think about this from sort of a negative perspective, this makes a lot of sense, right? I could not give up my right to exist to the government to have that regulated on my behalf. I could not give up my right to pursue happiness to the government to have that regulated on my behalf. Okay, I mean, these are things that we are stuck with no matter what. All right, so we know that God, the Creator, has granted us with certain inalienable rights. We're going to focus today on that first one, the right to life or the right to exist. Now, as a sidebar for a second, that is not an exhaustive list. There's an important word in there. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sort of hedges the bet. This is the framers saying, hey, you know what? We can identify these three, but frankly, there may be more. Okay, and as human beings develop, have a greater understanding of themselves and their universe, they may very well discover other rights that exist out there. But again, we're going to focus right now on the right to life, or as I prefer to say, the right to exist. All right, so now we have the Constitution, right? And the Constitution essentially says we are going to recognize some pre-existing rights to the formulation of the Constitution in and of itself, one of which is the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Now, what's the purpose of the Second Amendment? The purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect against tyranny, but it's also to allow you to be able to preserve your right to exist. It's consistent with the Declaration of Independence itself. Okay, well, I do hear people sit there and say, well, what's the difference then between a right and a privilege? Well, as I mentioned earlier, rights are not finite. There isn't a basket of rights that, God told Moses, these are your 3 rights and there's nothing else that exists. No, we could conceivably have greater rights. In fact, there are rights that might exist out in the universe that we can't even conceive of at this point in our human development. That being said, because it's so difficult to sort of presuppose what a right is, we actually tend to define it in the negative, what a right isn't. We look at something and we determine whether or not it is a right by looking at the methodology that a government would be required to use in order to take it away. Because governments can take rights away, right? There is usually a judicial process for that. Inalienable means you can't give it up. It does not mean that it can't be forcibly extracted from you given a certain set of circumstances. So what then are we to make of what is a right and what is not a right? Well, the easiest way of defining what a right is not is by simply labeling it. We say it's a privilege, right? If something is a privilege, then by definition it's not a right. And if something is a right, then by definition it's not a privilege. All right, well, we know what's required to take away a privilege. They just simply take it away. The government has no legal obligation or no operational obligation to put in a framework to take away a privilege. And for years, most of the issuing agencies would argue that the concealed weapons permit was really a privilege. You didn't have a right to that. Thankfully, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin put an end to that nonsense. The Supreme Court said, no, the carriage of a firearm outside the home is a fundamental right, all right? And as a result of that, there are certain requirements that are necessary in order to have that right taken away. And this is, by the way, how we take away a right. To determine whether or not something is a right, we look at the methodology required to extract it from someone. If the government wants to take away a right, first, the individual who's going to be subjected to government extraction is going to have to be given notice that their rights are in jeopardy of being lost. Subsequently to being given notice, they have to be afforded due process. And due process is bifurcated into two separate formats. They have to be given what we call procedural due process. There has to be an actual forum that's predictable, where there's certain rules that are in place where we can argue against our rights being taken away. And they have to be given substantive due process. There has to actually be a fruitful discussion. There can't be an arbitrary and capricious analysis on the part of a tribunal to simply remove someone's rights. All right. So that's how we decide whether or not something is a right. Well, clearly, in the Second Amendment analysis through the Bruin decision, we know that it is, in fact, the Second Amendment is, in fact, a right. More importantly, it's a specifically enumerated individual right. But as I said, rights exist across a much broader context than simply our Second Amendment rights. Our ability to engage in freedom of speech, our ability to be able to freely assemble, our rights to be secure in our possessions, our right to counsel, all these different types of rights are pre-existing. They were not granted by the government. They were recognized by the government. Now, if you take this to its philosophical conclusion, we start seeing some interesting things. First and foremost, if the creator is the thing, the person, the anthropomorphic God that granted us our rights, then it is logical fallacy to assume that God sat there and said, I am going to bestow humanity with certain inalienable rights. However, for a group of people that are going to exist in a place called North America, specifically north of the country of Mexico and south of the country of Canada, for individuals that live in that particular geographic spot, well, I'm going to give them super duper rights. That doesn't make any logical sense. I mean, there's nothing canonical that would actually suggest anything like that would have happened. And it's counterintuitive. Rights are universal. By understanding that, we now know that the Second Amendment to the Constitution exists in Mexico. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution exists in Belarus. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, that exists in China. It's just that those states are not enlightened enough to understand that those rights exist. Our country is. Our framers had the insight to see that these pre-existing rights actually did exist, and they codified them in the Constitution. As a result of that, the Second Amendment, it's not just a right for Americans to keep and bear arms. The Second Amendment is a human right on a global sphere that allows people to keep and bear arms. Again, not all countries are enlightened as ours. Again, as always, if you need to contact me, please do so at stephen@artemishq.com. And as always, train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.
Before you go, you just missed one of our best videos that got over 500,000 views. Click right here to watch it now.